Hi everybody. Last week we talked about King Saul and how he had come to try to kill David, and he had come very close to David. and David had thwarted him again. He went when Saul was asleep, and he took his water and his spear and was able to show them to Saul. So Saul realized that David had chosen again not to have vengeance on him and let Saul escape. And Saul promised that he would not follow David anymore and try and kill him. Well, we all know that his promises were not very good, that his jealousy would always overtake, and he was keen on killing David. So David wanted to go and find a place once and for all that he would feel safe from Saul. Remember, he had at least 600 men with him, and they had wives and children at this time, so it was hard for them all to be moving around the wilderness all the time. So David chose to go to live among the Philistines. Remember, he had tried that once before, just himself, and became so afraid that they would capture him that he pretended he was crazy and ran away. But this time, he came to King Achish of the Philistines, and King Achish actually gave him a place to live in the area where the Philistines were. It was called Ziklag, and he allowed David and his men and their families to live there. And he figured, since David was basically Saul's enemy, that David would not be loyal to Israel, he could be loyal to Achish. And he knew David was a good warrior. And so he was happy actually to have David and his men with him. So David and his men lived in Ziklag for a while. And it was a fairly peaceful time for them. They didn't have to worry about Saul chasing them and trying to kill them. But then something happened. The Philistines were going to go to war against Israel. In fact, a bunch of the kings of the Philistines were coming together, and they wanted to go together to make war against Israel. And Achish was so happy to have David in his country. He thought, I'm going to get him to come with his men. They'll really help us to defeat Israel. Well, obviously David and his men did not want to defeat Israel, but they didn't know what else to do, so they went along with King Achish. But when they got to the battlefield, the other kings saw David, and they said to Achish, what are you doing? He's an Israelite. You can't have him fighting on our side. He's going to turn against us and fight for Israel against us right in the middle of us all. You can't have him here. We don't want him here. And so King Achish had to send David back home. But when David and his men got back to Ziklag, they found that it had been burned. And their wives and children had been kidnapped, and all their stuff was gone. Well, at first, David's men were so upset, and you can imagine how upset they would be. Their children and their wives had been kidnapped. They were so angry and upset that they even threatened to kill David themselves, these men who were so loyal to him. But the Bible says David encouraged himself in the Lord, and then he asked the Lord if he should pursue the people who had come and done this. And God said yes. And then David asked God, will we be able to rescue our family? And God said yes. And so David and his men took off. Remember, they had already journeyed to the battlefield and then come back. And now they were going again in another direction, and they were getting pretty tired. So 200 of the men became so tired they couldn't go another step. So David got them to stay where they were and keep charge of all the stuff they were going to leave behind. And then the rest of the men who still had energy would keep pursuing those who had come to kidnap their loved ones and burn their city. Well, in a field on the way, they found an Egyptian man who was almost dead. He was lying in the field, and a couple of David's men found him and took him to David. And David said, give him food and water. And when he was finally feeling well enough to speak, the man told David that he was the servant of an Amalekite. And the Amalekites had just been going around marauding. They had gone around to all kinds of cities in the area, and they had burned and pillaged and kidnapped and stolen. And on their way back home again, this man had gotten sick, and his owner was like, oh, so troublesome. I'm just going to leave you in this field and keep on going. So that's what they had done, and the poor man had not had anything to eat or drink for 3 days. And so David said to him, could you tell me where they've gone? Could you come with us and show us where they've gone? And the man said, well, I could, but you have to promise me you will not give me back to my owner. And David promised, and so the man showed them where these Amalekites were. And when they got there, the Amalekites were having a party. They were dancing and eating and drinking and having a lot of fun because of all the stuff they had got and all the slaves they had captured. They were so excited. Well, they did not know that David and his men, these warriors, were watching them. And so sure enough, David attacked, and it was a long battle. There was a lot of Amalekites, but God gave David and his men the victory over those Amalekites. And they were able to rescue all their family members who were safe and unharmed, and they were able to recapture all this stuff that had been taken from the different cities, including their own. And so they happily were able to go home, and God gave them the victory in that area. Well, don't forget that back in Israel, King Saul knew the Philistines were coming to battle against Israel. And King Saul was worried. He wasn't just worried, he was distressed. He was anxious. He was scared out of his mind. And back when Saul had first become the king and he listened to what God said, God had told Saul to get rid of all witchcraft and witches and everything to do with Satan out of Israel. And Saul had done that. But now, remember, God wouldn't talk to Saul anymore because Saul had been disobedient, absolutely refusing to listen to what God had to say, doing his own thing. And so now Saul wanted to talk to God and he couldn't. So what was he going to do? He thought, I wonder if there's any witches left. He asked his servants to find him one. And they found out about a woman in a place called Endor who said she spoke to dead people. Well, Saul was so desperately frightened of the Philistines. He disguised himself. Because remember, he was the one who had made the law that witches were not allowed to be in Israel. And if they found them, the law was they had to be put to death. But now Saul wanted to talk to one. So he disguised himself, took 2 servants, and actually had to go on a long journey past the Philistine army to get to this woman. He got there in the middle of the night, and she didn't want to talk to him because she knew if anyone found out that she was practicing witchcraft, that she would be killed. But he finally convinced her to talk to him. And she said, what dead person would you like to talk to? And Saul said, Samuel. So the witch was trying to call up Samuel. Well, God works in ways that he can do whatever he wants. And he wanted to allow Saul to hear what he had to say. So God allowed Samuel to appear before the witch. Well, the witch was so frightened. She actually screamed, and she turned to Saul and she said, "You have deceived me. You are Saul. Why have you done this?" And Saul said, "Don't be afraid. I need you to ask Samuel a question." Well, Samuel spoke to Saul and said, "You know that God won't speak to you. You have disobeyed. You put yourself into this mess. Now, why have you called me here?" He was angry with Saul for doing this, of course. Well, Saul asked Samuel if Israel would win the battle against the Philistines. And Samuel let him know that Israel would not win the battle against the Philistines, that this was God's judgment on Saul. Finally, as he had promised, Saul would lose the kingdom. Samuel clearly told Saul that by the next day, Saul and his sons would be with him. In other words, they would be dead. Well, Saul was so frightened. He was overcome with fear. He fell on the ground. Remember, he probably hadn't eaten much. He had had a long journey. It was the middle of the night. And now this terrifying news. He fell on the ground and he refused to eat or drink. The witch and his servants were trying to get him to eat, and he wouldn't eat or drink or anything. He was so frightened. Well, they finally convinced him to eat, and he got up his strength and he went back home. And then he had to go to battle. The Philistines were there on the borders, ready to come into Israel. So the next day, Saul went to battle. And just as God had said, Israel lost the battle against those Philistines. And Saul was shot with arrows. Jonathan and 2 of his brothers died in the battle. And Saul asked his armor bearer to kill him, actually, because he was afraid of what the Philistines would do if they caught him. And the armor bearer would not kill him. And so Saul fell on his own sword and killed himself because he did not want to see what the Philistines would do to him. Well, there was a man that happened upon Saul after he was dead and took his crown and his cup and went to David and told David what he had seen, that he had seen Saul on the battlefield, and gave the crown and the cup to David to prove that Saul was dead. And instead of rejoicing, David was sad. He was serious. He was sober. He was sad because it was his friend Jonathan who died. And he was sad for Saul. Saul, who had started out with such great promise, who was anointed by God to be the king of Israel and had such opportunities to be a blessing to so many people, and then had turned bad and had been killed in battle as a result. David was sad. And so he even made a song. He wrote a song. Remember, he was a songwriter. He wrote a song, "How Are the Mighty Fallen?" And he referred to Saul and his sons, especially his best friend Jonathan. And he realized that God was going to now go ahead and make him the king as he had promised. But it was a fearful reminder of what happens when people turn away from God and refuse to do what he wants them to do in the place that he has put them. And so David did not have to fight his own battles. He did not have to revenge himself on Saul in any way. God did his own plan in his own time, taught David many lessons on his way to making him the king. So that is the end of our lesson for today. And next week we'll talk about David as the king. Thanks. Have a good week. Bye.